Let me see. Let me share the PowerPoint first. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here. Thank you, Stuart, for all your kind introduction. I've been invited to talk about the governmental responses to the crisis so far in a much more comparative sense. So being part of this series of video presentations is really a good opportunity because we get to come together and see the same issue from different disciplinary angles. So my angle will be a more comparative political science kind of perspective. So some of the terms or terminology might be a little not so easy to grab in the first place, but I think many of them are still quite self-explanatory. So, and also we can cover or explain some of the details in the later part in Q&A part. In terms of the topics, I think so. The three main questions the presentation will revolve around include questions like which countries have been most successful in their responses to COVID-19? What are the key learning that the US or other countries can take from the handling of the crisis? And how have international governing bodies like the WHO mainly played a role? So I really appreciate these questions, but I might have some more nuanced interpretation of the questions here. For instance, the first one is more like which countries have been so far allowed enough time to be successful or to approve themselves successful, because we do have the cycle issues of the whole outbreak. So some countries, they start to showing this indication of being successful, but actually the time factor does play an important role here because many of the outbreak in China and in most of Asian countries predate the outbreak in other regions of the world at least 1 month, maybe up to 2 months if you're comparing cases here with the first outbreak in China. So some of the questions can be adjusted, but I think they will be the main topics for today. I think also why I situate these questions in the context of Asia versus Europe. To many of us, it's quite obvious so far, but I think it still makes sense to show you this graph. I have been using this graph also with my international health governance class last week. So sorry, I wasn't able to insert the interactive graph of this version. So I'll just take you to the original site. This one. We can just let it run because it only takes really a couple of seconds. So China is the first outbreak of COVID-19. And then you see lots of countries led by a few East Asian countries like South Korea, Japan, and Singapore, and then many more outbreak in the rest region, the rest part of the world. If we, sorry, a little bit background information of this data set. The raw data of this graph is from our world. Oh, sorry, I think I should have.
You're not sharing.
Yeah, I noticed that. Let me. Sorry about this interruption. Okay, this is the website I'm referring to. The raw data is drawn from our world in data. So country cases will enter this data set when they hit case number 100. So the starting point is here. And then this is how many days since the total confirmed cases of COVID-19 reached 100. There are different reference lines in terms of different slopes of doubling rate. Here it says doubling every 10 days and doubling every 5 days, and then 3 days, 2 days. Okay, I'll redo the. So China is the first case to lead up the whole outbreak, and then a couple of Asian countries follow up, and also many other regions many other countries in different regions. If we focus focus on Asia, all these Asian countries in red, it's a little problematic because it also includes some countries from Middle East, but we can ignore that problem for a while. So just by looking at these countries in red, we know many of them have been taking lead to so-called flatten the curve recently. Flatten the curve in the sense of level of the curve, or try to contain the spike of infection by leveling, sorry, it should be, so it's the spike or the surge of most critically ill person. This amount of case of number should be controlled so that the whole health system in the country is not overburdened. A couple of countries has already flattened the curve, but if we focus on Europe, European countries in blue and North American countries in green, many of them are still in the initial process of bursting out with ever steep slope of doubling their cases. So it's really far from reaching the peak of the outbreak. So that's something I think should serve as a pretty good starting point. And we know it's a necessary background. Why do we really situate the questions in the sense of comparing Asian countries with America or with other countries, especially European countries right now? So going back to our slides, let's move on to next one. I'd like to start with China, and later on we will see it actually serve as the extreme end of the spectrum in terms of being most lenient toward most draconian kind of countermeasures to the outbreak. One of the most extreme measure, which I think it's really widely known by the whole world, is the complete lockdown. The first lockdown is in Wuhan, in the city. It's a citywide lockdown, but it extends to the whole province, which include about 16 cities. So it's the province, Hubei province-wide lockdown, which includes 16 million people covered in that region. And then after about a little bit more than 1.5 months, some peripheral cities in Hubei province already start to reopen their borders in a very gradual pace. So that's a general timeline that some of the regions currently under lockdown can expect to experience. And then household by household sweeping programs of screening and examining based on its existing community grid management systems. I think, as I personally take from this point, is that this is the most important feature of China being an authoritarian state. The underlying social political institutions are already there. It's based on community, and each community is further divided with groups of households or units, like maybe 15 households becoming one unity, and local government will have community officials to collect information and make sure everybody is under control. So that kind of typical practice can be dated back to China under Maoist period. So one takeaway point I think from this one is that China didn't really invent something suddenly to control the whole population. It's really an underlying and persistent penetrative political power for the state to absorb or insert itself into the society at the very grassroots level. So based on existing community grid management, lots of community officials can pick up this task to take people's temperature household by household. And if they find someone is having fever, they will enforce home quarantine, which is, they also develop some technology based upon that. I have some pictures to follow up on that. So aggressive electronic surveillance, which is also another typical feature of an authoritarian state's kind of way to govern the population, and enforced home quarantine, which I think is a big difference between whether you have good order or not, and whether you really have those orders taking in place, actually enforced. I think that's a different question. And then national mobilization of medical and even military resources and personnel to relieve Wuhan and the Hubei province. That's also a typical way for China to handle national crisis. It's always isolate the issue, singulate the problem, and mobilize the whole resources across the country to support or to assist the specific like hardest hit region of the country. And something relatively minor here is rapid massive construction of emergency fields hospitals, which is also an old practice they picked up from 2003 when the country combated the outbreak of SARS, which I will also talk about later. It's something similar with other East Asian countries. This is some of the the pictures I found online. It's widely shared also. So for instance, the pink seal on the top, it's made of paper, so it's really just symbolic, but they do have some electronic devices installed to the doors of the household who are supposed to be isolating themselves. And they have some sticker on the door saying, just to remind you, out of courtesy, I am resting at home, please do not visit me. And also you have dates here. Someone will be tasked to take their temperature every day and put a little check there. So it's a really rigorous enforcement of house quarantine. It's not like you just isolate yourself from your relatives and friends and try not to come out of the house too much. It's literally staying at home for the entire 2 weeks. And when they open up the door and trying to work out, these electronic device will automatically send signal to the community officials. So on their phone, they will receive message, oh, someone is coming out of their households. And then on this site, QR house code. This is being widely used because many Chinese people in China right now are gradually going back to work, and they are ordered to install these apps on their mobile phones. So if you have and also these apps on the mobile phones have access to all these individuals' health information and travel history, and whether they are eligible to going back to work or not. So the employers, it's easy for them to just scan the code and find out everything they need. So that's also another precaution they are really having right now, to have the people really gradually going back to work and gradually open up borders again in terms of Hubei province. Something quite similar in South Korea and Singapore. I won't be able to go to too many details, but a very I think it's very important differences from China's experience is that none of these countries really institute a complete or total lockdown. It's no complete shutdown of their borders. And some similarities are that they both of them have really swift and wide-scale testing techniques and systems in place from the very early stage of the outbreak. For South Korea, they have pretty good interventions like walking through testing booths, drive-through testing centers, which is one of the earliest countries to ever develop this facility. And then mobile clinics coming over to suspected cases rather than having everybody going to the hospital. And also contact tracing system, which is also shared by Singaporean experience. And also they developed their own tests, which really mitigate the problem of not having enough tests to confirm the cases. No lockdown for Singapore either. And also one feature with Singapore is that they have a really good government website online to give people moment by moment or day by day updates of all those confirmed and numbered cases. So for every case, they will let the whole public know what's the most updated health status of this specific case, and where is this person located, what's the neighborhood, the community information, and even the demographic information of this individual. So I don't think all of these measures can be transferred to other regions of the world, because different political cultures, societies, they receive these kind of measures with different level of acceptance. But these are some of the practice they are actually using. So people will try to avoid that region, that locality, and they will take extra precaution when they have to be around or something like that. And also in Singapore, people will have their temperature taken at least 2 to 3 times a day. And whenever they have a normal temperature, they will have a sticker. So after a whole day, it's very normal to have multiple stickers on your shirts. It's diligent contact tracing as well, and also strict social distancing. Something really specific about Singapore is that because they start to take these restrictive measures in the very beginning, so they have the luxury to even separate or alternate healthcare systems. They want to make sure there are some physical separation between different teams. So if something happens, one team has to be isolated for some infection, they have other options. They have alternative personnel to take over. This is really different from the situation right now for most regions of the world. We are handling with the situation of we don't have enough medical personnel on site. But Singapore, back from the very beginning, they have this luxury to do that because they responded really quickly right after the outbreak. Okay, so that's also something like a side point, because I don't want to make convey the message like East Asian countries have already achieved success. I think it's just too early to claim a victory right now. And they have been reporting a lot about this second wave in East Asia, other than China, especially for cases in Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, when they did really excellent job during the second half of February. But since the starting of the new month in March, many imported cases have been reported for these East Asian countries, and they have to deal with the new cases. Some of them are national, traveling back from Europe, and they coming back to home. But some of them are international students. So that's also another challenge they have to face right now. So I don't think it's a good time to just claim, oh, East Asian countries has been so successful that outbreak is complete there. I don't think that's the factual reflection of the local situation. Okay, so a little bit of similarity before we going on to the main spectrum I'm trying to show you. Similarity, some of them are already covered by some of the studies, but I also add some extra points from my own understanding. The first one is the past memory of combating the 2003 outbreak of SARS, less so in terms of the 2009 H1N1 influenza. That's something really huge for East Asian societies, and some of the Singaporean health experts, the word they use is that experience is likened to be baptism by fire. So the whole city-state is forced to pick up the burden and learn from the lesson. They also has the metaphor like it's like swimming on the deeper end of the pool. So it's survival. It's a survival existential threat to the very survival of the city-state. And also for country cases like Taiwan, they have, I think it's something like a national academic command center, that kind of organization set up to give quick response to any future outbreaks like SARS. So actually they have lots of the institutional infrastructure already in place. The thing they have to do is only to activate them. They don't have to build up something from vacuum. They already have them, and they only need to reactivate them, and also to pull out all those human resources to tackle the crisis. State capacity, in terms of a willing and capable state that actively intervenes in the economy and social and yeah, in the economy and in society issues to achieve public objectives. I think there is a very established body of political economy which use the concept of state, developmental state, which means state take an active role in economic activities to boost the country and to realize high growth in GDP. So that's really, the concept is really in opposition to the dominant neoliberalism economic philosophy in the West. But people in Asia in general, most of them, they expect the state to behave really actively and even preemptively in national crisis. And that concept is not to be confused with concepts like authoritarianism and dictatorships, because the cases we just covered, they do cut across the divide between democracies and non-democracies. So it's not a simple problem of regime type. I think that's still relevant, but it's not going to explain the whole picture. Modest popular faith trust in government is especially obvious in Singapore and less so in China and South Korea. Although there are many episodes about people protesting like individually on their balcony to scream for help. Yeah, episodes like that are still out there. I think there are more, but still, I think the vast majority of Chinese people included have a modest faith in the government, and they just follow what government order them to do, and they think they are trying to serve the interest of the general public. Hong Kong is a little different. It's not in terms of trust in government, but more trust in social institutions. They have a really robust social society. So when people's trust in government is failing these days, especially given the last year's whole episodes, persistent public protests for democracy. So people do not have that strong trust in government, but they, as community, they still have much solidarity among each other, especially towards civil societies, and they can play a role to help the community. Political culture, this is something more general, and I think it warrants more systematic political culture study on this one. But the general sense is that East Asian societies, they value collective welfare over individual rights, especially in crisis. Yeah, I think it's only can be speak of in a general sense. And nationalism, China and South Korea, typical cases of strong nationalism domestically. And also Taiwan and Hong Kong, they have a very specific sensitivity toward anything happening in China, even more sensitive than some provinces inside China, because China appeared to them as something quite uneasy. So any sign, any indication of disturbance domestically in China, they will take signals. They will try to be prepared if anything larger or more consequential will happen to them. So I think all of these factors are relevant. So I just have a list here, and it's not exclusive. I think maybe in the later discussion part, you can have more feedbacks to complete the list somehow. So this is the spectrum I was mentioning in the beginning. I put China, especially Hubei province, its full-on lockdown and surveillance type of countermeasure as the most extreme version of draconian countermeasures on the one side of the spectrum. And the other side, theoretically, I think it's the herd immunity, which UK initially brought it up and then quickly reversed the whole stance. But theoretically, herd immunity is something like doing nothing, just let enough people get infected and develop immunity, so they can serve as a fend between the disease and the most vulnerable individuals of the community. So at least you will have at least 60% to 70% people to get infected by the disease. And later on, they abandoned this stance because some research shows the human cost would be tremendous. So we will talk about that a little bit further later. In the between, I put cases like South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong here, and Singapore, as I said, it's nothing draconian, but more effective and sweeping kind of measures, especially consider that South Korea and Singapore and Taiwan, they don't really have a complete shutdown of their country. Even in Singapore, it's really unique. I think I forgot mentioning just now, a unique atmosphere in Singapore is that people do not wear masks. That's something really controversial in Asia, especially in the eyes of their East Asian neighbors. They have been criticized, Singaporeans, how can you not wear masks? Because like the ubiquitous mask wearing is now is a type of Asian single, like Asian people have this culture to wear masks. Even you are healthy, you try to protect the others, but it's the entirely different practice in Western societies. Anyway, so that also single out the Singaporean case. And then Germany, France, and some other states, some states in the US, I think they start with a relatively languishing pace, but they pick up relatively quickly and ramping up the capacity to control the infection of the disease. Especially Italy, it's moving much more tougher than now. And even one of the toughest governmental measurement in the world today is practiced by Italy. And many of the countries European countries are moving forward toward that direction to have more aggressive measures taken, have them in place. And UK is somehow joining its counterparts in European continent. So a little bit further information on the herd community theory in UK. So these results already dissuaded the Johnson administration to give up on the previous herd immunity theory, because the curves here, you might have different versions of that. Maybe you have seen a lot. So the more draconian countermeasures are taken, the more likely you are going to quickly, not in a sense in a very quick sense, but it's more likely you're going to have a substantial flattening effect on the curve, so that the whole capacity, especially the surge critical care bed capacity, can somehow be preserved to focus on the most critical cases. So we are moving on to a country case. I have one country case, just one from Italy, and I think France and Germany. I don't know all those details, but they follow the general tendencies to taking up more aggressive orders and also try to enforce them. The case in Italy, the situation right now, I think, yeah, during the weekend, there has been the first sign of narrowing increase in both infection and deaths. That's a good thing, but they have lots of lessons to teach the rest of the world, I think. So being the second oldest population on Earth, 23% of the population are over 65. But they do have world-class hospitals and medical resources. It's just overwhelmed by the sudden outbreak of so many cases. So one specific feature with most of the European cases, I think also include most states in the US, is a piecemeal approach. Like step by step, they start with isolation of a couple of towns on February 22nd, and then regions, like northern regions, the whole northern region, and then national shutdown. I think during this point of time, most of countries do not have that opportunity, the window of opportunity to afford this kind of piecemeal approach. It's a little risky. So it's better to have swifter responses to the infection and to enforce the shutdown in a more effective and ready manner. So, and another problem with their orders is the so-called intentional loopholes. Not many people use that word, but I think the underlying sense is that some of the orders you have them, but the government also doesn't want to treat any backlash from the population, which might say, oh, that's just too much and it's overreaction, and we still want our civil liberties reserved, and also economic growth can be preserved. So I think the government is also trying to figure out what is the degree of acceptance for the population. But in comparison to Asian countries, I believe the government doesn't need to worry too much about that, because they have a good expectation in the population. The people will follow most of their public orders. So the European countries might be hesitating a lot here, but this is a good case for the following countries to follow suit. Another issue with Italy, although I'm not an expert in Italian politics, but I do realize some debates have been going on about intense regionalism in the north, because they have a huge disparity between north and south in terms of economic development and also medical resources. So intense regionalism and competition maybe, and also some party politics can be dragged into this response to the pandemic. It affects the national coordination. So that's a little bit comments on Italy. Finally, we are on the case of the US. This is the 1.3 acres website. It's one of the main websites I have been like really rely on for the daily updation a lot. Currently, you see, not in terms of cumulative cases, but in terms of the growth rate, US US is having the tendency of overtaking China, and already Italy in terms of growth rate. Yeah, and this small map here shows us the hardest hit regions in the US. And some of the most updated information on this is that recommendation has been made for some of the regions not to have all those cases to be tested, just assume they have the virus. And that's a way to preserve those scarce medical resources like masks, like ventilators and intensive care beds. So tough situations have been made, and I think the situations are rapidly changing every day, every moment. That's something we can also comment back and to have a further look at. As I said, it's still quite similar to the general European tendency, but the complicated condition of the US is, one of them is because so many states, they have different situations. And also the other thing is that the health insurance access, which is also quite different from the rest of the world, especially from Western European countries. I was also asked to just comment a little bit on the role of WHO. So I had a list here. I think the main task, the main job it's been doing is to update the world, especially provide some authoritative announcements, like name the whole outbreak, rename it to COVID-19. And in the first place, before that, WHO also declared a public health emergency of international concern. It's quite a big deal in public health field, but I don't think back then people paid enough attention to that. It's the general global community is like, oh, what is that? Should we be concerned? Maybe, probably not, maybe probably too early. So it's really blurred, like what are these terms actually conveying, like how serious the situation is. Even pandemic, on March 11th, the WHO made the assessment that COVID-19 can be characterized as a pandemic, but we also had the same discussion in class. There is no clear definition of pandemic anyway. So it's a word to raise people's awareness maybe, but it doesn't really have any clear and substantial information with the pandemic. It didn't change any country's response to the outbreak. some other points here. Actually, China in the end of December reported the new pneumonia case with unknown cause to WHO, and also on January the 3rd, I think, when China has 40-ish cases already, it also shared the genetic linkage of the disease. So it's not like no sharing of how come China didn't like inform the whole world about this outbreak and how severe, how consequential this can be. There is some information going on, information collection and sharing going on. It's just the rest of the world is not paying enough attention to the possible situation, to the possible consequences of the outbreak. Something else WHO has been doing is to organize some research trip or a mission. Yeah, the report, the PDF report here, I also copied if you would like to take a look at it. So the report is released on February the 28th. It's conducted by a joint team between WTO and the Chinese government. I don't know how to really assess its role. Being an international organization, it's not just the problem with WHO. Many international organizations have the same problem. How to coexist with nation states, which have sovereignty, but international organizations, they don't have an transcending enforcement capability to order any country to do anything against their will. They can only make recommendations. They can persuade countries to take more aggressive measures, and they can persuade countries to report them, to alert the whole global community. But there's nothing like really solid, really like in terms of given a command. It's not their responsibility, and it's really out of their the domain of their tasks. So, so in conclusion, it's really general. I think community of common destiny, this is something actually brought up by President Xi of China. He argued this community of common destiny should be the driving force of China's foreign policy. I think it's relevant to reuse that term a little bit here in face of the COVID-19 challenges. I doubt whether the answer to the question, I put a question mark here, it can be a yes or no answer. Probably yes, but as I see it right now, based on country by country experience, it's more like a no, because there is no international government to take responsibility instead of national governments. So it's really, really upon the shoulder of domestic governments to come up with more initiatives and take up more stringent measures to help contain the disease, to contain the infection. The second point is that I think the most successful, sorry about the typo. The most successful measures are not necessarily the most stringent ones, but early, clear, and enforced ones, especially with very clear direction. And when you have orders, you have to also enforce them. And of course, if you can do it better rather than late. Effective measures in other countries might not be readily transferable. Again, the Singapore case, I recommend it. It's one of the most successful experience so far. But how many countries in the world can actually copy that experience? It's really it's not that viable in practice. You don't have that tiny territory, you don't have the tiny population. And of course, they are not really entirely dependent on Malaysia, which is around you, and also the livelihood can be neatly closed to Malaysia. So shutdown is not an option actually for Singapore. So every country have their so unique and indigenous features with them. Not many Western European countries, Northern American countries are willing to accept too stringent measures. Now I think it's more acceptable, but it takes time to adjust to what kind of measures are legitimate to be used. own experience is more relevant than copying from others' experience. Own experience in the sense of the history of this particular country, in the history of combating previous public health crisis. And those experiences can be better utilized to preserve, those experiences should be preserved and even inherited to improve the capability of these countries to fight future outbreaks. I think that's the end of the presentation part. It takes longer than I expect, but I welcome all your questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. This is Stuart Desenhall from the Drew Communications Department again. I have a couple questions here, and you can continue sending them through the Zoom chat function or by email. The first one is, how have citizens in affected countries been of service during this time?
Yeah, this is one of the first questions. As I see it, they can be very different for countries already with quite stringent measures in place. The best cooperation from the citizens is to follow the orders, to stay at home, don't hang out, don't make excuse, don't try to have their own interpretation of those orders. So staying at home and browsing online, and so just, yeah, be cooperative. And for some of the, for countries like, for cases like Hong Kong, they are really active in cooperating with community supporters and some existing civic associations. They can help with the ordering of the masks, because there is increased need there still going on. It's not just Hong Kong, but some other countries, some other regions, and also for different types of medical resources. So individuals do help a lot. Just in episode in some episodes in China is during the Wuhan lockdown, many takeout workers, they receive orders from the individuals who are locked down, who are isolated at home, and they take their orders and they go to the restaurants who are like takeout only, and they pick up their food and they deliver back to those individuals or households. These stories are like propagandized a lot recently in China as the really touching stories, and the whole society has been putting things together and try to stay home as long as possible. So I guess the best cooperation the government can receive, or the whole country can have, is to receive cooperation from citizens, just to follow the orders.
Thank you. Okay, another question. Someone said, I've heard that prior presidential administration's pandemic plans put in place by the National Security Council were obfuscated when President Trump let go of a number of people in that department. Do you know if this is true, and can you elaborate on what obstacles President Trump has presented that have contributed to our faltering progress? Most importantly, is he and are we on track to get things done correctly and expediently at this point?
About the White House National Security Council, I don't think I'm really well positioned to judge whether every piece of the information is authentic or not, but I think it's kind of a fact that the organization is disbanded, or at least substantially streamlined by the current administration. That's something really echo with a point in the presentation, is that Taiwan, as one example, after the outbreak of SARS in 2003, they built up something really well functioning at the national level, and they are specialized in giving responses to public health crisis. So those institutions, although after the whole outbreak, you can deactivate that, but you preserve it and you lived there until next time it happens again, when some other disease is coming back at the society. So those institutions can be readily put into place again very quickly. So I don't think it's a wise decision to disband National organizations like National Security Council, they should be preserved in place. It's a little hard to make any counterfactual comparison, like if we do have them in place, whether it's going to be a different situation right now. That's hard to say. But I believe the U.S. as even at the federal level, the country should have a national coordination center. They do have one, or something like a special task force. But if you have an pre-existing institutions already there, and people with experiences can be pulled together to strive together, and the national resources can be coordinated, I think that will be much better, and the country will be more prepared in that sense.
Thank you. A few more. One asked, when was the first case in China known in China, and presuming that it was before Beijing announced it on December 30th. I think this is referring to your timeline slide.
There are news and reports saying the first case could is some case documented in late November, but there is no clear information on patient 0 in Wuhan. And although people say a lot, the whole disease originated from the wild animal market in Wuhan, but that's something not quite true. Lots of studies on the very first cluster of cases, they do find evidence that some of them do not have any contact or overlapping or travel history of being in that specific market. So I don't have that kind of specific information, but I do think the most documented, the first documented case can be traced back to November, to the end of November. But further information, I'm not that clear, and people have been still debating about that according to different scientific angles.
Okay, the next question. It was said that China was not secretive, but that other countries were not paying attention. How do we square that interpretation with the early silencing of doctors such as Li Wenliang?
Yeah, I kind of expect this question when I was speaking about that point. I said it in the context of China report to WHO. So in the sense of China enforce the international community, but domestically, China covered a lot in the very beginning stage, when the earlier whistleblowers were invited for a cup of tea. Actually, it's admonished by local public security to silence on those new cases, because back then they do not have any idea what it is about this new strain of disease. They were sure that's coronavirus, and they knew that's something novel. So back then they have the term novel coronavirus a lot. They still use that in Chinese language. So the initial reports was like, oh, we find new SARS cases. So that's something quite sensitive, politically sensitive, because back then in 2003, that was a huge national crisis as well. So local government wanted to make sure whether it's something serious, or whether they are making things up, or whether they have been overreacting. So they have different guesses back then. But I think the first responses for many local governments in China, in the central province, is to minimize public outcry or public concern or fear. They have lots of concerns on their own side, and they typically, we understand local politics in China is that local politicians, they report to their superiors. So they report to city level, they report to provincial level officials, not really report to their constituencies. There's no democracies working in China, especially in that level. So I think the default response, which is very sad, is still for local governments to cover up that kind of information without sending more people to figure that out. So, I mean, again, as I was trying to say, this you can perceive it as different when China enforced the world. That's one case. That's one side of the story, and the other side is domestically, the very early cases are covered. Otherwise, China will be more responsive, and they wouldn't have to face the tremendous human causes later on.
Okay, thank you. I think we have time for three more, which have already been submitted. So the first of those three, there seems to be a lot of concern in the US regarding the economic impact of the coronavirus and that the cure may be worse than the disease. What have other countries done to mitigate the economic impact of the virus?
That's a really tough trade-off. Economic costs is something for sure. China also suffered a lot. The whole first 3 months of GDP growth is like somehow substantially offset by the whole pandemic situation. So I don't think in the face of pandemic of this scale, which putting lots of threats to human costs, to human lives, and you are during the process of making life and death decisions. Economic costs is something like coming afterwards, something coming at the second order. I think sometimes, of course, we do want to mitigate economic costs, but sometimes tougher decisions like that have to be made. Since many of countries have been pick up more and more aggressive measures, and many of them are doing lots of harms to economy, but that's something necessary, I think. In general, as people still continue to live and the community will get back together after the outbreak, and economic growth can be picked up later. And people always like learn from their past errors, and later on when people are more prepared for future outbreaks, economic cost can be reduced accordingly.
Okay, we have time for two more. One of those, how has the role of production of various protective materials like masks and gloves varied in the case studies that you've seen and talked about?
I do see lots of cases about medical personnel have to come up with some makeshift PPEs. They are running out of qualified ones, but they still have to go in there and they need to protect themselves. And in early stages when hospitals in Wuhan were overwhelmed, those healthcare workers, they put on raincoats, just wearing raincoats to enter into those intensive unit rooms. So yeah, they still have to be there, and whatever precautions you can take, just use them. And not just the US, but many other countries, political leaders have make recommendations how people can reuse masks, but you have to disinfect it with alcohol and lots of different measures that you can take. So I think during these very difficult periods of time, it's normal for many countries to run out of this medical, most of the medical resources. This is another advantage for taking action earlier. So why countries like South Korea and Singapore, they are relatively less affected by the shortage of medical resource because they respond earlier. So now it's really a tough situation. European countries and most states in the US already lost the so-called golden window period of time to respond to the outbreak. Now the situation is just the reality that we don't have that kind of abundant resources. But even within the very limited available resources, people can improvise a little bit. It's better than nothing, I think. So PPEs are something essential, but without them, people can still pull through most of those tough cases. So I still have faith, as long as people can follow order, can observe all those seemingly restrictive measures. Maybe in another 6 to 8 weeks, we will see the peak and the outbreak will be complete, hopefully.
Okay, we have time for just one last one, and then we'll let Professor go. The last one, what do you think would be the result if the US made sudden changes to their current approach? Is it too late, and how might the numbers change?
I don't think it's too late. In theory, nothing is too late until you are following the herd immunity approach. So the herd immunity approach is actually literally do nothing. It's more like a suicidal response to the outbreak. So as long as states are not giving up totally, I think there is still hope, even for US, for European countries. Actually, we have a little like slight indication that even the situation in Italy is getting better. So as long as we follow through, as long as we have more aggressive, more fitting and clear and enforced orders in place and people follow suit, and I think after a couple of months, the situations will be taken under control. That's something I am quite confident with. So even because we pick up this topic in our international health governance class, when most people in the States are less concerned, our class is quite active in discussion of this pandemic, not pandemic back then, but the very likelihood of this epidemic transferring to the rest of the world, especially in the States. Is the States ready? So most of the students in my class, they are certain that it's not ready, of course. So, but when people were in the darkest age of fighting COVID-19 in China, again and again, many health experts there, they thought people have started to have this concern, this battle is never going to end. So many people are dying, but it only took like 1.5 months after these draconian countermeasures, Hubei province is actually reopening up. So I think that's hope for the whole world, as long as people follow through, comply by all those measures ordered by the government and cooperate with the government. Yeah, cooperate and also monitor the government, like both mutually. So I think the outbreak will be overcome. It's only a time of matter. It's only a matter of time. Sorry.
No problem. Thank you so much, Professor Tang, for taking the time to talk. Hope everybody enjoyed it. And if you are interested in rewatching this or following up with any questions, you can email me at sdesenhall@drew.edu, which is in the original email that invited you to this meeting. And we will be uploading this whole presentation to YouTube and sending it out on our website and social media if you want to watch it again or clarify anything. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you so much. Stay healthy and take care.
Guys.